The signature looked almost perfect. That was how I knew it was fake. At 7:18 on a gray Monday morning, I was standing barefoot at my kitchen counter in North Carolina with a cup of coffee cooling beside my hand and a certified envelope torn open in front of me. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 46 years old, and for 12 years I had made a living buying small properties that needed work, fixing them carefully, and holding on to the ones that made sense. I had signed enough closing documents to recognize my own name without thinking about it. The paper in front of me carried that name in black ink. Daniel Mercer. Beneath it was a signature that curved the way mine curved, ended where mine usually ended, and looked convincing enough to fool someone who had never watched me write it. But the capital M was wrong. I had written my last name the same way since high school, with the first stroke leaning slightly left before cutting back across itself. This one leaned right. I stared at it for maybe 5 seconds before I noticed the notary seal. Then I read the first property address. I owned it. The second address was mine too. I turned the page. More legal descriptions. More references to Briarwood Commons. The language was dense, but the meaning was not. According to this document, I had voluntarily signed an authorization giving expanded administrative and property control rights over assets I had spent years acquiring. I had never signed it. I had never sat in front of that notary. I had never agreed to those terms. My phone rang before I finished reading the final page. Cynthia Caldwell appeared on the screen. Cynthia was 53, president of the Briarwood Commons Homeowners Association, and she had spent the previous 2 months trying to convince me that her redevelopment plan would be easier if I simply cooperated. I answered without taking my eyes off the signature. "Morning, Cynthia." Her voice was calm, polished, almost cheerful. "Daniel, I wanted to make sure you received the recorded documents." I looked toward the hallway where a wooden drawer held 14 labeled property keys. "I received something." "Good. Then you understand the transfers have already been recorded. There is nothing left to discuss." I could hear papers moving on her end of the call. Somewhere behind her, a printer started humming. She sounded like someone closing a file. I felt the opposite. I moved the document closer to the window and studied the ink again. Wrong M, wrong angle, wrong signature. "Cynthia, when exactly do you believe I signed this?" There was a brief pause. "The notarized acknowledgement is attached." "I can see that. Then I am not sure what you are asking." I turned to the page carrying the seal. It claimed I had personally appeared before a notary on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks earlier. My coffee suddenly smelled bitter. I remembered that Tuesday. I remembered exactly where I had been, because I had spent most of that afternoon at a closing table in Charlotte. Cynthia continued speaking about administrative consolidation, recorded authority, and the redevelopment schedule. I barely heard her. I was staring at one sentence beneath the seal. "Personally appeared." When she finally stopped, I asked the only question that mattered. "Who watched me sign this?" The line went silent. The silence on the phone lasted 3 seconds, but it was long enough to tell me Cynthia had not expected that question. Then her voice returned, smooth and measured. "Daniel, if you have concerns about the acknowledgement, you should speak with counsel." "I probably will." I ended the call before she could turn the conversation back into another speech about administrative authority. Then I walked down the hallway and opened the oak drawer where I kept 14 brass keys on labeled rings. 12 years of my life fit inside that drawer. The first key belonged to a 2-bedroom townhouse I bought when I was 34, after spending nearly every dollar I had saved on the down payment. The kitchen cabinets were crooked, the carpet smelled like cigarettes, and the back deck leaned badly enough that I rebuilt it before anyone moved in. The second property came 18 months later. Then another. I never bought 14 houses at once, and I never inherited a portfolio. I built it one closing at a time, usually choosing modest townhouses and small rental homes that needed repairs other buyers did not want to handle. I replaced flooring, repaired drywall, rebuilt porches, painted bedrooms, changed faucets, and spent more Saturdays in hardware stores than I could count. By the time Briarwood Commons expanded around several of those properties, I owned 14 units scattered through the development and along 2 neighboring streets. Cynthia first approached me about them 8 weeks before that certified envelope arrived. She invited me to the Homeowners Association office on a Thursday afternoon and placed a 30-page agreement across a polished conference table. She called it an administrative consolidation agreement. The room smelled like fresh coffee and lemon furniture polish. This simplifies everything, she said. I read the first 6 pages without speaking. The agreement would have expanded the association's authority over parking assignments, landscaping access, rental approvals, maintenance coordination, and several shared use areas connected to my properties. Some provisions were routine, others were not. This gives Briarwood control I never agreed to when I bought these units, I said. Cynthia folded her hands. It gives the community consistency. It gives the association discretion over privately owned property. Her expression barely changed. Most owners understand the benefits. I pushed the agreement back across the table. Then most owners can sign it. I am not going to. She looked down at the signature line, then back at me. The redevelopment schedule is already moving forward. That does not change my answer. Cynthia leaned back in her chair. Behind her, architectural drawings showed new landscaping, redesigned parking lanes, and a renovated community entrance. Daniel, eventually, everyone signs. I remember that sentence because of the way she said it. Not angry, not threatening, certain. I left without signing anything. Over the next several weeks, Briarwood sent revised proposals, compliance notices, and requests for another meeting. I declined every document that changed my ownership rights. Each time, I saved a copy in the blue accordion file where I kept records for all 14 properties. Now, standing in my hallway that Monday morning, I looked at those 14 keys again. Cynthia had been right about one thing. Eventually, my name did appear on her agreement. The problem was that my hand had never put it there. The first sign that something had changed came from a tenant named Melissa Grant at 912 that same morning. She rented the townhouse on Hawthorne Lane, the third property I had ever purchased, and she called because a Briarwood notice had appeared on her front door. "Daniel, are you still managing this place?" she asked. I stopped halfway across my kitchen. "Why would you ask that?" Paper rustled against her phone. "This says future exterior requests and parking matters have to go through Briarwood Property Administration." I told her not to sign anything and asked her to photograph the notice. 30 seconds later, the image appeared on my screen. My address was correct. My property identification number was correct. At the bottom was a reference to the same administrative authorization sitting on my counter. I opened my laptop. The county records portal took less than a minute to load. I searched Hawthorne Lane first. There it was, recorded 3 weeks earlier. Then I searched the townhouse on Maple Ridge Drive. Another filing. Same date. Same authorization reference. I checked Cedar Brook Court. Another one. By 10 o'clock, my coffee was untouched and 7 browser tabs covered the screen. 7 properties. 7 recorded instruments. I kept going. 8, 9, 10. Each document used slightly different legal language, but every one pointed back to the same supposed authorization carrying my signature. The house was silent except for the hum of my refrigerator and the clicking of my mouse. 11, 12, 13. I hesitated before entering the final address, a small brick townhouse near the south entrance of Briarwood. I had renovated that place myself 6 years earlier, replacing the flooring and rebuilding the back steps over 2 long weekends. The search result appeared. 14. I leaned back and stared at the screen. Nothing had physically changed outside. My keys were still in the oak drawer. My tenants were still living in their homes. The deeds still showed my ownership. But a new layer of recorded paperwork had been placed across all 14 properties, claiming authority I had never granted. That distinction mattered. Nobody had magically taken 14 houses with one sheet of paper, but someone had created documents that could interfere with management rights, association approvals, access decisions, and future transactions if nobody challenged them. I printed the first instrument. Then the second. The printer warmed the room with the smell of toner as page after page slid into the tray. By 11:15, I had 14 packets spread across my dining table. I placed them in chronological order and circled every reference to the original authorization. Same document number, same execution date, same notary, same signature. That was when the scale of it finally became clear. I was not looking at 14 separate mistakes. I was looking at one document being used 14 times. My phone buzzed with another message from a tenant. Then another. Briarwood notices were already moving faster than I was. I walked to the hallway, pulled the blue accordion file from the cabinet, and carried it back to the table. Inside were 12 years of closing statements, title policies, contracts, and signatures that I knew were real. I placed the forged page beside the oldest closing document and studied the two names under the kitchen light. The difference in the capital M was still there. Small, almost invisible. But now I understood the real question was no longer whether somebody had copied my signature. It was how far that copy had traveled. By noon, my dining table looked less like a place to eat and more like a title office after a long closing day. 14 recorded packets sat in 2 neat rows beside the blue accordion file, and I started comparing every questionable signature against documents I knew were genuine. Purchase agreements, deeds, loan papers, insurance forms, closing statements. My real signature changed slightly depending on whether I was rushed, but the capital M always began the same way. Left stroke, cross back, down. The signature on Cynthia's authorization did something different. Right stroke first. Once I saw it, I could not stop seeing it. Still, handwriting alone was not enough for me. I needed something that did not depend on interpretation. I turned to the notary acknowledgement. The document stated that I had personally appeared at 2:35 on Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks earlier, and confirmed my identity before signing. I opened the calendar on my phone. Tuesday, 2:35. Charlotte. I felt the room become very quiet. That afternoon, I had been sitting nearly 100 miles away in a conference room at a title company, closing on a small duplex with another investor. I had arrived shortly after 1 o'clock and left after 4. There would be records. I opened my email and searched the date. The closing confirmation appeared immediately. Then a parking receipt timestamped 1:14 in the afternoon. Then an electronic receipt from the title company sent at 4:12. I called the closing attorney's office. This is Daniel Mercer. I need confirmation that I attended a closing with your office 3 Tuesdays ago. The receptionist asked me to hold. Soft piano music played for less than a minute. Then she returned. Yes, Mr. Mercer. Our file shows you checked in at 1:22 and completed the closing shortly before 4. Can you send me written confirmation? Certainly. 5 minutes later, it was in my inbox. I printed it and placed it beside the notarized acknowledgement. 2 pieces of paper. 2 locations. Same afternoon. They could not both be true. I leaned back and looked toward the hallway where the 14 keys were still inside the drawer. Cynthia had told me the recorded documents ended the discussion. Instead, the notary date had started a different one. I spent the next hour examining the certification information on every packet. The same notary name appeared again and again, Rebecca Sloan. Same commission details. Same underlying authorization. The individual property filings were not 14 independent agreements signed on 14 different days. They all depended on that single document Cynthia had spent weeks asking me to sign, and I had repeatedly refused. I pulled her original and signed proposal from the blue accordion file. The language was nearly identical. Page numbers matched. Paragraph order matched. Even a small formatting error on page 17 was still there. The only meaningful difference was the last page. The version I had rejected had an empty signature line. The recorded version had my name written across it. My phone buzzed. An email from Briarwood had arrived with the subject line Administrative Transition Complete. I opened it and read the first sentence. Cynthia was informing property managers that the new authority structure was effective immediately. I printed that too. Then I placed it on top of the growing stack. She was moving quickly because she believed the recording made everything permanent. I was moving slowly because I was beginning to understand exactly where the document could break. At 1:47 that afternoon, I stopped studying the signature and started following the stamp. Rebecca Sloan's name appeared beneath the same notary seal on the authorization used across all 14 filings. So I wrote her commission information on a yellow legal pad and checked it against the public notary record. The commission existed. The name existed. That did not prove Rebecca had watched me sign anything. I called the number listed for the office address on the acknowledgement. A receptionist answered with the name of a small administrative services company located less than 2 miles from Briarwood Commons. I am trying to confirm a notarization performed 3 weeks ago, I said. Can I speak with Rebecca Sloan? The receptionist paused. Rebecca is not in today. Can you tell me whether she was working Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks ago? Another pause. You would need to speak with her directly. I thanked her and ended the call. I was not interested in pressuring a receptionist into giving me information she should not disclose. I needed records, not rumors. I returned to the 14 packets and started tracing where each one came from. Every filing referenced the same administrative authorization. Every association notice quoted language from that authorization. Every change Cynthia claimed was already effective depended on the same signature page. Then I opened the Homeowners Association meeting minutes Briarwood had emailed owners during the previous 2 months. Cynthia had discussed redevelopment, parking coordination, landscaping access, and rental administration repeatedly. But I could not find a board vote specifically approving the document that supposedly carried my signature. That bothered me almost as much as the forgery itself. At 2:30, I called Mark Ellison, a Briarwood board member I had known casually for years. Mark, did the board approve an administrative consolidation agreement covering my 14 properties? He was quiet for a moment. I remember discussions about your units. That is not what I asked. Then no, not one agreement covering all 14, at least not at any meeting I attended. I wrote his exact words on the legal pad. Did Cynthia ever tell the board I signed one? She told us the ownership issues had been resolved. There it was. Resolved. A word vague enough to sound official without explaining anything. I thanked him and did not tell him what I had found. By 3:15, the paper trail had narrowed into one straight line. Cynthia wanted expanded authority. I refused. An authorization appeared with my signature. That authorization was notarized on a day I could document being nearly 100 miles away. Then the same document was referenced across 14 separate property filings and used to justify notices to my tenants. I still did not know who physically wrote my name, and I was not going to accuse anyone without proof. But I no longer needed to guess about the structure of the scheme. 14 properties were balanced on one foundation. If that foundation failed, everything built on it became questionable. I opened the blue accordion file again and found the title policy for my first Hawthorne Lane purchase. The closing attorney's name was printed at the bottom, Laura Bennett. She had handled 6 of my later transactions too and knew the ownership history better than almost anyone. I had not spoken to her in nearly a year. I placed my phone beside the 14 keys, pulled her contact information onto the screen, and looked once more at the forged capital M. Cynthia had spent weeks trying to get one signature from me. Whoever created this document had given me something much more valuable. One point of failure connecting all 14 properties. At 3:38 that afternoon, I made the phone call Cynthia should have been afraid of from the beginning. Laura Bennett answered on the second ring. Her voice sounded exactly as I remembered it from years of closing tables and last-minute title questions. Daniel Mercer. It has been a while. Laura, I need you to pull every recorded instrument connected to 14 properties I own around Briarwood Commons. Her tone changed immediately. All 14. Yes, I believe an authorization carrying my signature was forged. There was no dramatic reaction, no gasp, just the sound of a keyboard. Do you have certified copies? I have recorded copies, the unsigned agreement I rejected, proof that I was in Charlotte when the notarization supposedly occurred, and written confirmation from the closing office. Send everything. Do not sign any corrective document from Briarwood, and do not agree to anything over the telephone. I looked at the 14 keys lined across the table beside my laptop. How quickly can you review it? If the same authorization touches every property, quickly enough to know whether we have one problem or 14. I sent the files while we were still speaking. The first attachment was Cynthia's original and signed proposal. The second was the recorded version. Then came the 14 property filings, the notary acknowledgement, the Charlotte closing confirmation, parking receipt, title policies, and Briarwood's administrative transition complete email. Laura stayed quiet for almost a minute. I could hear pages clicking open on her computer. Daniel, the deeds still show you as owner, she finally said. That matters. What these filings appear to affect is claimed authority and administrative control tied to the properties. We need to be precise about that. Understood. But if the underlying authorization is invalid, anything relying on it may have a serious problem. That was the first time all day I felt the floor stop moving beneath me. Not because the situation was solved. It was not. Because somebody who understood the title chain was now looking at the same thing I was. Laura asked me to read the recording number from the authorization. I did. More keyboard clicks. I see it. Then silence. And I see the references attached to the other filings. All 14. Give me a moment. I waited. Outside, rain began tapping lightly against the kitchen window. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Finally Laura spoke. Yes, Every one I have checked so far points back to the same authorization. I looked at the forged capital M under the dining room light. So if that document fails, then we challenge the filings that depend on it. But we do this correctly. Certified records, title review, formal notice, and whatever corrective process the recorder or court requires. One telephone call does not erase recorded documents. I know. Good. Because Cynthia may act like recording something makes it true. It does not. Laura told me her office would contact the title insurer, obtain certified copies directly from the county register, and prepare a fraud escalation package. She also wanted the original email chain showing that I had refused to sign the agreement. I forwarded it immediately. Before we ended the call, she asked one final question. Has Briarwood started exercising the authority it claims? I looked at Melissa's notice, then the email sent to property managers. Yes. Laura's answer was calm. Then save every notice. At 4:26, we hung up. The call had lasted 48 minutes. Nothing outside my house had changed. The 14 keys were still on the table. Cynthia was still president. The filings were still visible in county records. But for the first time, her paperwork was no longer moving uncontested. And somewhere inside a title office, 14 separate property files had just been opened because of one signature Cynthia believed nobody would question. Tuesday morning, Cynthia acted like nothing had changed. At 8:16, Briarwood sent another notice to my property managers stating that all parking approvals, exterior maintenance requests, and shared access questions involving my 14 properties were now subject to the new administrative structure. At 8:23, Laura forwarded me a copy with 3 words above it. Save this too. I did. Cynthia was building my evidence folder faster than I could. By 9, Laura's office had obtained certified copies of the recorded instruments and opened a formal review with the title insurer. The county records matched the copies I had downloaded, right down to the same authorization number and the same notary acknowledgement. At 10:11, Laura called. We confirmed something important, she said. The same authorization is referenced in every disputed filing. There is no separate signed agreement for any individual property. I looked at the 14 keys still lined across my dining table. So one document supports everything. Everything we have reviewed so far. And if that document was not signed by me, then Cynthia has a much larger problem than she appears to understand. Before I could answer, another call came through. Cynthia. I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, the transcription appeared. She wanted me at an emergency Briarwood board meeting Thursday evening to discuss what she called my continued refusal to cooperate with an already completed transition. I forwarded the message to Laura. Her response came almost immediately. Attend. Say very little. Bring copies. For the next 2 days, I watched Cynthia behave like someone standing on concrete without realizing it had never cured. New notices went out. A landscaping contractor emailed me asking whether Briarwood now controlled access scheduling at 3 of my units. A property manager forwarded instructions supposedly issued under my authorization. I saved every message. Meanwhile, Laura traced the recorded paperwork backward. Wednesday afternoon, she found that the package submitted for the 14 properties had been assembled within a 48-hour period shortly after my final written refusal. Thursday morning, she confirmed that the signature page attached to the recorded authorization was identical in every filing, not merely similar. Same ink pattern in the scanned image. Same placement. Same wrong capital M. At 1:37 Thursday afternoon, my phone rang again. Laura did not bother with small talk. Daniel, we found the email chain you sent me particularly useful. Which part? The message where Cynthia acknowledges receiving your refusal. I remembered it. Cynthia had replied, we will proceed with other available options. At the time, I thought she meant another proposal. Laura continued. That email is dated 4 days before the document says you voluntarily signed the agreement. I stared through the kitchen window at the rain-darkened street. So she knew I had refused. The record shows she knew you had refused 4 days earlier. Be careful about saying more than we can prove. That was Laura. Precise even when the facts were getting ugly. At 6:20 that evening, I drove into Briarwood Commons carrying one blue accordion file. The clubhouse windows glowed against the wet pavement. Cynthia's white sport utility vehicle was already parked beside the entrance. Through the glass doors, I could see her at the conference table arranging folders in front of each board member. She looked composed, prepared. Certain. Then my phone vibrated once. A message from Laura appeared on the screen. We found the same authorization attached to all 14. Formal challenge notices are ready. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, picked up the blue file, and walked toward the door. Cynthia thought the meeting was about whether I would cooperate. She still did not understand that the question had changed. Now it was whether she could explain a signature I had never written. The conference room smelled like coffee and damp wool when I walked in at 6:28. Cynthia sat at the head of the table beneath the Briarwood Commons seal, wearing a cream blazer and the same composed expression she had worn when she first pushed the agreement toward me 8 weeks earlier. 6 board members occupied the remaining chairs. Mark Ellison looked at the blue accordion file under my arm, then quickly looked away. Cynthia began before I had even taken my seat. Daniel, this meeting is intended to resolve your refusal to comply with the administrative transition. I set the file on the table. I understand. She opened a folder and distributed copies of the recorded authorization. The association has a properly executed agreement, a notarized acknowledgement, and recorded instruments covering the affected properties. Nobody interrupted her. When a copy reached me, I placed it beside mine. Same wrong capital M. Cynthia continued for nearly 5 minutes, explaining redevelopment efficiency, parking coordination, maintenance access, and the authority she claimed I had voluntarily granted. When she finished, Mark cleared his throat. Daniel, did you sign this? Cynthia turned toward him. The document is notarized. Mark kept looking at me. That was not my question. I opened the blue file. No, I did not sign it. The room changed instantly. Cynthia leaned back. That is a serious accusation. I am making a statement about my own signature. I placed the Charlotte closing confirmation on the table, then the parking receipt, then the email showing when I had checked into the closing office. This acknowledgement says I personally appeared before a notary here at 2:35 that afternoon. At that time, I was nearly 100 miles away in Charlotte completing another transaction. One board member picked up the documents. Another leaned closer. Cynthia did not touch them. Scheduling records do not invalidate a notarized instrument, she said. That will be determined through the proper process, I replied. And that process has already started. The door opened behind me. Laura Bennett entered carrying a slim black portfolio. Cynthia's expression finally shifted. Laura introduced herself as my title attorney and explained that certified copies of all disputed filings had been reviewed. She was careful with every word. My deeds still reflected my ownership, but the association had relied on a disputed authorization to claim expanded administrative rights across 14 properties. Formal challenge notices had been prepared, the title insurer had opened a fraud review, and parties relying on those filings were being notified that the underlying authorization was contested. Cynthia folded her arms. The association acted on documents presented as valid. Laura looked at her. Then the association should preserve every email, draft, submission record, and communication concerning how those documents were created and recorded. Silence. Mark asked the next question. Did this board authorize the agreement? Cynthia answered quickly. The redevelopment committee gave me broad administrative authority. That is not what I asked, he said. I almost smiled. Laura removed one final page from her portfolio. It was Cynthia's email acknowledging my refusal 4 days before the supposed signing date. Cynthia read it without speaking. Then Laura explained the part that mattered most. Every disputed filing traced back to the same authorization. 14 properties. 1 foundation. 1 signature. If that authorization could not be authenticated, Briarwood could not safely continue acting as though its claimed authority were settled. The board voted that evening to suspend every new administrative action based on the disputed document until council completed its review. Cynthia stared at me across the table as the vote ended. You did all this with 1 phone call, she asked. I closed the blue accordion file. No, Cynthia, you did it with 1 fake signature. The 14 keys stayed on my dining table for another 19 days. Nothing about the correction happened as quickly as Cynthia had pretended the original transition had happened. Laura's office worked through certified county records, title files, formal notices, and the procedures required to challenge each filing that depended on the disputed authorization. The title insurer reviewed the chain. Briarwood's attorney instructed the association to stop exercising any authority based on the document while the matter was investigated. my tenants received temporary notices confirming that management instructions still came through me. Then Rebecca Sloan, the notary whose seal appeared on the authorization, provided information through the formal review that changed the entire case. Her records did not show me appearing before her on the date listed in the acknowledgement. I had expected the wrong capital M to matter. I had expected my Charlotte closing records to matter. I had not expected the notary record itself to leave the signature with nowhere to hide. Laura called me shortly after 10 on a Wednesday morning. "Daniel, we have enough documentation to move forward with the corrective process on all 14. I looked at the keys lined beneath the kitchen window. All 14. All 14. Corrective instruments and releases were prepared. The disputed claims were formally addressed through the appropriate recording process, and the records tied to my properties were restored to reflect the ownership and authority that existed before Cynthia's authorization appeared. The deeds had never stopped naming me as owner, but now the paper trail surrounding them no longer carried Briarwood's disputed claim of expanded control. One by one, Laura sent me the confirmations. Hawthorne Lane, Maple Ridge Drive, Cedar Brook Court, then the others. 14 properties, 14 files cleaned up, one false foundation removed from beneath all of them. Briarwood held another board meeting the following week. I did not need to argue this time. Their attorney did most of the talking. Cynthia was removed as president pending the association's internal review. Every notice issued under the disputed authorization was withdrawn, and the board sent written corrections to my tenants and property managers. The question of who physically wrote my signature and how the false acknowledgement entered the recording package was left to the appropriate professionals and authorities. I was satisfied to let evidence travel where evidence needed to go. A month later, on a quiet Saturday morning, I finally cleared the dining table. I returned 13 keys to the oak drawer, then held the Hawthorne Lane key for a moment before placing it beside them. That little brass key had been the first one. 12 years earlier, it represented almost everything I could afford. Now it sat beside 13 others that someone had tried to control with a signature I never wrote. I carried the blue accordion file to my office and added the certified corrective records behind the original closing documents. Before closing it, I placed Cynthia's forged authorization beside a genuine signature from my first purchase. The difference in that capital M looked obvious now. Strange how something so small could carry so much weight. Cynthia had believed authority came from recording a document, sending notices, and speaking as though the argument was already over. But paperwork does not become truthful just because it receives a stamp. She needed my name to take control. In the end, my name was exactly what gave everything back.